Good evening. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to 2024 elections. My vote, my choice. My name is Faraz Patel. Now, this is the last of our shows from an interview perspective in our studio because, inshallah, from tomorrow we'll be coming to you live from the ROC at the Gallagher Estate in Midrand. And of course, we'll be taking you through right up until results day, which will be on a Saturday, inshallah. Now, I've brought a very special guest because he's going to be with us for those days, giving us in-depth analysis, sharing his wisdom and knowledge, and of course, discussing with myself how the elections will be unfolding in terms of results-wise during those days. Let me give you the great pleasure of welcoming Mr. Angelo Fick. Angelo, assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for joining us here on 2024 elections.
Wa alaikum salam to you and to your viewers.
Angelo, for those who maybe who lived under the rock, because everyone should know who you are if you are following politics, but those who lived under a rock, talk to us about your journey into the politics world. Obviously you're part of ASRI, but you wear many hats in terms of just the political knowledge of yourself. Maybe just a sort of introduction to yourself and how you got into the space.
So I was a vague career academic for about 20 years at different universities across South Africa. And then I turned 40 and decided to change careers a little bit. I kind of fell into television analysis because that was never the plan. And I think my parents, when they were alive, were slightly ashamed of television work for me because they said, how do you go from being a university academic to people telling us they see you on TV? And then I think after 4.5 years in broadcast, which I found really valuable, and lots of lessons from very good journalists, and had opportunities that I don't think I would have had I not done that, ended up working for the Awal Socioeconomic Research Institute as a return to my sort of academic research roots. And yes, I think I got into the analysis of politics because even when I was an academic, my research was on the social dynamics of South Africa. And having taught across both literature as well as sociology and other such disciplines, understanding how South Africa works and how particularly post-apartheid South Africa came to be and does work was and has been and continues to be very useful for understanding the dynamics of the political spaces in which parties work, but also in which citizens get to live.
Angelo, you of course done in-depth studies of, because we all know about South Africa's great divide from rural to urban. Your analysis over the last 30 years of that divide, because so much has not been addressed within South Africa, and talk to us about, through your studies, how you were able to maybe gather that information, and as we see till today, still that divide that exists within the country.
So the South Africa of the colonial and apartheid era constructed an indigenous population as alien from towns and cities, except where they could deliver labor. And this goes all the way back to the 19th century for much of the country, and all the way back to not the rural-urban divide, but the insider-outsider divide in that first point of contact, which ironically is also the first point at which Islam happens to exist in South Africa, the old Cape Colony. Insiders and outsiders, labor units who were useful but certainly weren't considered part of the space in which politics, life, social events, and the economy was happening, however essential they were. And that was a forcible prevention of migration of people through either the colonial legislation or through the influx control legislation of the later colonial and apartheid eras. What we've seen in post-apartheid South Africa is a rapid urbanization by particularly black and rural South Africans to off of farms, off of the homelands areas into our towns and cities. And they were beginning to join a pattern that is global. So from about, I think, the year 2000, 2010, the majority of people on Earth were living in towns and cities, not in rural areas. And South Africa sort of caught up. And I think over the last 10 years, South Africans are majority town and city dwellers. And with the consequence that the underdevelopment of the rural population and their possibilities lives on in the peri-urban peripheries of our cities, where lots of rural people settle. And some of the failures of the post-apartheid state include the inability to address reintegration of the society giving greater opportunities for rural development, but also dealing with the opportunities and life chances of people who no longer wanted to be in rural areas and legitimately, under freedom of movement in the Constitution and the vision of the Freedom Charter, wanted to live in cities and towns and not providing things like social housing, development, opportunities, economic development. And that's all three tiers of government failing. And so my sense of the urban-rural divide is that it has historical roots, but it has contemporary re-articulations and reaffirmations of those inequalities of life chances, development opportunities, and self-actualization scenes. And the solution isn't just to continue to develop rural areas, because some people exercise the legitimate choice of no longer wanting that life, and giving them all of the, shall we say, opportunities and resources for them to make their lives in towns and cities.
I want to touch on the rural aspect of this, Angelo, because there's still so many citizens of the country that want to stay in the rural area because they feel a historical connection, or they just want to live a life of peace. The political party campaigning, because some of these rural areas still have infrastructure that's not working. So from your analysis, how have you seen campaigning happening still within the rural area to convince them that we can still make your life better, whether it's the current ruling ANC or the opposition that are really trying to capture the hearts and the minds of the rural citizens of our country?
So the incumbents in government will claim the building of access roads, different relations to belonging on the land, not necessarily ownership of the land, and that's different. And then my suspicion is that many of the opposition parties will campaigning about deservicing of those rural areas by the incumbents. So we've seen, for example, the failure of the post office has had consequences in the rural population, because the post office was often one component of service delivery, that you could get all sorts of things done. It was a source of banking, it was a source of contact with the rest of the world. Failure to do the digital migration in time have left a lot of rural people off the information grid. Not expanding the electricity grid or the water supply grid has often complicated rural people's access to basic services, including energy and the life-giving substance of water. And then second or tertiarily, and the third phase, what political parties I think are trying to campaign upon is the way in which they envision changing the rural. For the incumbents, the problem is they've had 30 years in which they have or haven't done it. For the incumbents in the Western Cape, there are particular problems in Western Cape rural spaces, including farm relations with labour, the rearticulation of farms that used to be labour intensive in both the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, from being agricultural spaces to being tourist spaces that are not as labour intensive. So if you take a pineapple farm and you turn it into a game farm, you know, people become forcibly urbanized because their labour isn't required. And what I don't hear from any of the political parties is a vision that includes rural people into a unified vision of South Africa, which does require a rural hinterland for agricultural purposes. But only 12% or less of this country is arable, so agriculture is not the only thing that should be done in rural areas. Incorporating rural areas and the people who live in them in vast provinces like Limpopo or the Northern Cape is a crucial component of making people feel they belong in a South Africa that is not lagging behind the urban spaces in terms of not just access to services, but the ability to articulate a life in the 21st century. So access to the internet, access to digital media to give you information about the world, access to all of the amenities that allow people to self-actualize and make a choice about whether to remain in the rural or move to the urban. And then the third component is none of the parties are articulating a vision for rural life that specifically addresses the challenges of the climate catastrophe unfolding and how rural life will shift over the next 60 to 80 years. And that, I think, is a major failure on the part of our political parties to address not just the next 5 years, but the life chances of the children and the grandchildren of the people in those rural areas, inside areas they may wish to stay in.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Angelo Fick, Hilaal TV's 2024 elections political analyst. Do stay tuned. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Welcome to 2024 elections. My name is Faraz Patel. I'm in conversation with Angelo Fick. Of course, we'll be with Hilaal TV for its special broadcast from the ROC. Angelo, let's look at 30 years of democracy. And I was having a chat with a couple of friends and family, and even though there's many challenges that the country faces, we have come a long way. I can talk of personal experiences from schooling, be it primary or high school, where I was able to integrate in Model C schools with different races and an understanding there. You could now finally go to places where, of course, pre-94, even pre-1990, you were not allowed to. And so much has changed within the country. How does Angelo Fick see the 30 years of democracy within South Africa?
So there is no denying that we have travelled quite a distance from apartheid South Africa in some very important metrics, in some very important ways. Freedom of movement is one of them, freedom of association, freedom of political belief, freedom of expression in all sorts of ways. We have, even when we have not necessarily been able to do the work successfully, we have an architecture in the state that allows us to hold state actors responsible. So even when disasters have unfolded, we were able, and the survivors and their families were able to take the state on, whether it was Marikana, Life Isidimeni, the family of Andries Tatani, a variety of total misbehavior by the state, but citizens being able to hold the state to account. So the tragedies of post-apartheid South Africa are tragic. But we must not forget how long it has taken to hold the apartheid state to account for not even a few people, but thousands of families. So we have the Timor family story, but we also have the Gweniwe family story. We have people like Madeleine Fullard, who continues to work with people to try and find the remains of people disappeared under apartheid. So we must not forget that, yes, we have come a long way and we no longer face those crises. But that should not be the basis for us to be told we should be grateful that we're in a post-apartheid state. One of the gains of the post-apartheid state that we must remind our politicians about all the time is that it gives us the right to hold them to account, to call them out when they behave badly, and to insist that the state mechanisms that they have signed onto and that South Africans have voted to reinstate in election after election for 6 administrations should be the ones that they get judged on, rather than anything they did for us prior to 1994. Debts do not work in that way, and they are not the people who can call on us, the people who live here now, to be indebted to them. So I think a great distance has been travelled, but many of the promises that were made to us, that we made to ourselves as the 23 million people of 1994, haven't been realised. And those tragedies must be addressed. And if people who have governed or are governing cannot address them, they must accept when the South African public says to them, we've made other choices.
And it brings me to the next question about the Constitution, because obviously the fathers of the Constitution of our country and the mothers of the Constitution of our country, when they wrote that piece of paper, and then of course ultimately the Bill of Rights, it sort of like was seen as something of, we're doing you a favor because of 400 years of colonialism and apartheid, And it seems that many citizens have been resigned to it, whether it's the ANC ruling the country or the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape, where they show us a picture of the beauty of Cape Town, of the CBD, but then the neglecting of Khayelitsha, Langa, and so many of those places. It's that the politicians, and especially the politicians of today, feel like they've done everyone a favor by what they've done from their governance perspective. And you bring up something of holding accountable. How do we as citizens say, well, you're not really doing us a favor because the Constitution inscribes you to work for the people, to be public servants, and that the people shall govern?
So the Constitution, born out of the vision of the mid-1950s Freedom Charter, was a long-standing vision by a variety of liberation organizations, and yes, centered in the ANC in the second half of the 20th century. But let's not forget the other congresses of the mid-1950s participated in this. And the 1996 Constitution was also an articulation of, one, the society that South Africa should become in its democratic phase, and the society it needs to unmake, which it had inherited for the 100 years of colonialism in much of the country and the 350 years of colonialism in the Western Cape and other parts. So what we, I think, need to remind ourselves of is that the people who are elected are the people's representatives. Every time you buy bubblegum or sweets, you pay tax, and that tax goes into the fiscus, into the treasury, and so all of us pay the salaries in one form or another of the elected representatives. And that's not just the people who pay personal income tax, the people who pay corporate tax. We pay tax according to our means. Therefore, they should work for all of us, and we have constitutional court judgments reminding Parliament as well as the executive that the oath of office that they take is to protect and abide by the Constitution, not their party's dictates, not their individual desires, but what the Constitution requires. We as citizens also need to take some responsibility of not outsourcing our sense of who runs the country. These people have administrative tasks that we give to them, and we need to hold them accountable not just once every 5 years at national elections or once every 5 years at municipal elections, but throughout. And for many millions of South Africans, they are doing that. They're doing that through the consultative processes. They're doing that through agitation, petitioning, responding to pieces of legislation. We must support all of the organizations and sectors that are made available through a constitutional democracy to do some of that accounting and account holding on our behalf. And that includes civil society actors, civil society organizations, Chapter 9 organizations, including the IEC, the Public Protector's Office, that really belong to us, not to the politicians. And it is time for us all to realize we all belong to this country, and we all should take ownership of the processes and structures by which this country is run. Not outsource it to parties or individuals, but all participate, and all, when need is required, protecting those spaces. This is not to say the Constitution is something that should live on in its current form forever. We should be a dynamic society that when new challenges arise and we feel the need that new processes need to be invested in, so for example a new electoral act, new electoral processes, we should be happy to participate in that, give our input, and accept that the world and time only moves forward.
Angelo, you've of course been, along with ASRI, Radio Islam and ourselves, you have been covering many election debates. You've seen the campaigning, and it's a lot the rhetoric like the ANC, give us another chance please, the Democratic Alliance, the EFF, the other old-timers like the IFP saying, well, the ANC has failed you for 30 years, give us the chance. The new parties have come and said, out with the old, in with the new. That's sort of the rhetoric. But there's one thing that a lot of these parties haven't come up. They haven't come up with something innovative. They haven't come up with something that says, listen, citizen, I can give you something that's different that you haven't had for the past 3 decades. Is that something you've seen also?
So in an election like this, I'm not necessarily looking for those novel proposals, because what you then sit with is pie in the sky dreaming. And we have seen some smaller parties who are offering often not constitutional democratic proposals for what they see the future to be. I think given the precarious space we're in, I would fully expect the parties that are going to perform well to offer visions very much inside the existing order. So you have the incumbents, the African National Congress, proposing that their policies for the last 30 years have been good. Their implementation might have suffered from a variety of blights, some of them corruption, some of them other forms of crises, some of them what they call external forces. But this time round, they'll be better. And I think many of the voters have shown in the electoral results we've seen that they no longer trust that process. A 6th and a 7th term, maybe not what you're going to want from a plumber who said, next time I'll fix it better. For the two major opposition parties, the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance, governing in the Western Cape and in Cape Town, and now in a few municipalities across the country, particularly in southern KwaZulu-Natal and in northern Gauteng, the challenge has remained that the voices of dissent about their version of what it is that they do remain very, very clear. So the people of Bonteheuwel, Mitchells Plain, Langa, Nyanga, suggesting that for them, the miracle of the neoliberal Western Cape and the city does not work. The electoral results we've seen coming from the countryside across the Western Cape are also, people moving to parties that speak to them in ways that are possible because the Democratic Alliance hasn't delivered. And the economic freedom fighters, the test for them this election is, do they go spectacularly beyond the 12%, because they've shown themselves committed to debut at 6, which people poo-pooed in 2014, but actually is a significant achievement, to grow to nearly 11-12% in 2019. The test is, can they overtake the Democratic Alliance? Do they not overtake the Democratic Alliance? Do they not broaden their base? And all the opposition parties need to ask themselves, as the ANC has been in disarray for the last 15 to 20 years, it's been 18 years since 2006.
Yes.
Why is it that they haven't been able to draw more ANC disaffected voters to them? How has the ANC, despite all of these crises, continued to perform in the high 50s? And that, I think, is going to be the key challenge of this election when the results come in, for opposition parties to answer to themselves about why it is the results look the way they do.
Unfortunately, Angelo, we have run out of time, but we're going to have much more of you, of course, for the next 3 days at the ROC. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the ROC, Angelo.
Thank you.
That's Angelo Fick. He's going to be our official Hilaal TV political analyst, alongside with myself at the ROC, as of course we bring you that live coverage right here on Hilaal TV. For myself, Ross Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.